Good evening. My name is Andrew Holsinger, and I'd like to welcome you to the Grow Your Own Backyard Tree Fruits, the Science of Tree Fruits Revealed. I'll be your presenter for this session, and I'm located here in central Illinois, about an hour south of Springfield. So we'll start off our session talking about what kinds of tree fruits there are. There's two main categories: the pome fruits, which consist of the apple and pear, and there's also the stone fruits, which have the peach, sweet cherry, sour cherry, Japanese plum, European plum, and the apricot. Tree fruits, there is some work that's involved whenever you're going to grow tree fruit, and you need to think about that ahead of time. Also, having a place to put your fruit trees and selecting the right site is important. These trees, even though that they can be dwarf in a smaller size, they're still going to take up some space, and you're going to need more than one tree in most situations in order to have adequate pollination. And with that, we'll be talking about the different kinds of varieties or cultivars that you can use, and the particular need for different cultivars, the rootstocks, and how they affect the size of the tree, some proper planting techniques. You want to be sure and plant the tree at the adequate height and not plant it too deeply. You want to have adequate fertility so your tree will remain healthy, and proper pruning and training are always essential because you have to manage the fruit load on the tree, and thinning is a case of most tree fruit where you have to remove some of the fruit in order to have better sizing and a better quality of fruit. And with the quality of fruit, it's essential for pest management practices to be in place. So this is probably going to have some kind of a pest management schedule that you're going to have to adhere to. The possibility of pest management goes for if you're growing organic or if you are more of a conventional grower. And you can see the illustration of how the orchard setting can be throughout the seasons. So talking about the size of planting, we need to talk about space. There's trees generally take up a lot of space and room, and so if you have a small backyard, you're going to have to take that into consideration. And in that, you'll need to do a site inventory. So you'll have to investigate to find out where possible power lines are, where the water line is, where things that can get in the way of the growing of these trees. Think about your family size. How many apples can your family use? What are you going to do with apples or peaches or pears or plums or whatever kind of tree fruit you would choose? Some of you might be a favorite of green apples. Maybe that's what you would like to grow. As you see in this picture, there's a lot of Cub fans, I guess, that like green apples. Harry Carey had the quote of, "Sure as God made green apples, someday the Chicago Cubs are going to be in the World Series," and that was the case. But you might also have some Cardinal fans out there that like the bright, shiny red apples. So it's just depending on what you like and what your particular flavor is for apples. Some are sweet and some are tart, and this goes with our other fruits as well. Your available time will come into consideration. So what time do you have to take care of these trees? I know that there's some people that have grown tree fruit, and at the time of the pruning, they were away in a more warmer climate, because typically our pruning's done during the dormant season. And we'll be looking at pollination requirements, because our tree fruits are insect pollinated, and that is a requirement that we have to look at. Here we see tree spacing and expected yields. And so you can see that these trees do have a minimum distance that they need to have for you to establish them. A standard apple tree is a minimum of 30 feet, where a dwarf tree is only 8 feet apart. So you can have more trees potentially with the smaller sized dwarf trees, but they're still going to have the same kind of management for insects and diseases. And so we also have the typical yield on this chart of about how many bushels, or in the case of cherries, how many quarts you would yield. You need to take a soil sample whenever you're getting started. This soil sample is going to be a wealth of information for what kind of nutrients are in the soil, and you want to have an optimal pH of between 6 and 6.5. So you'll need to build up the soil with whatever nutrients are needed, amend those in before you get started, because tree roots are often difficult to contend with. I will welcome you to type into the chat box any questions. We have a question here. If you are growing a dwarf in a container, is there a recommended size? I would think that the root system of these dwarf trees are typically smaller. If they're grown in a container, you'll have to think about the overwintering of these particular trees, because typically the temperatures aren't suitable for the tree to be above ground in a freezing climate. So it would vary on the size of the trees, and I'd have to do a little bit more investigation, but typically the dwarf trees do have a smaller root system. So we're going to reduce our weed competition. Your perennial weeds, you want to look and make sure that those have been handled before you are competing with those weeds in your planting. You may consider cover crops. These cover crops have been popular in agronomic crops and even in the home garden, and they've also been used in an orchard kind of setting. So that could be something that could be tilled into the soil. And also consider your orientation of planting, how the direction of your planting is in accordance to light. You'll also need to think about your planting site for the slope. Generally 4 to 8% slope is ideal, but 10% makes it fairly difficult. So you may be limited on the site that you have if you're growing your fruit trees in your backyard, and I understand that, but it is good to know that fruit trees typically do benefit from good air drainage. The bearing age and life expectancy. So there's a few years that you have to wait before these trees are going to come into fruit. And so in thinking about that, usually your dwarf trees can have an earlier time till they start bearing the fruit, 2 to 3 years, typical bearing age. And then we have life expectancy. We see that our standard apples and apples in general generally have a longer lifespan, with the exception of pear. But the pear tree is typically not a favored in our kind of climate and area because of the disease pressure of fireblight. So that's an important disease we'll cover here a little bit later. So again, we're going to need to know the available space and also have a well-drained soil. Typically, your fruit trees do not like to have what they call wet feet or a soggy soil. An excellent air drainage, as we talked about the slope. There's places where frost pockets can occur, or sites that may have a strong or prevailing wind. And so all these come into consideration when you're getting started to find that just right site that you're looking for. A sandy loam is preferred, but locally a loamy, well-drained, deep soil will work. It's important to have adequate sun exposure. So you'll need full sun, a minimum of 6 hours. 8 to 10 hours is preferred. You can see in the photo here that the light is important. It aids to the coloring of the fruit and also the drying out of the leaves to prevent some possible disease occurrence. And be sure to have that adequate soil pH. Here's an illustration of air drainage. So the air, as we know, hot air tends to rise, but cold air doesn't, and so it travels downhill. But if there's a tree or an obstruction, then it can cause a frost pocket, and that can be detrimental to a planting of tree fruit. And so here we see on the left that there is an obstruction of a tree, and so it causes a frost pocket. But with the good air drainage on the right, the cold air can accumulate in the valley. Here's a picturesque photograph from a commercial orchard. And so you're probably not going to have this expansive amount of space, but you can see just in general how the sloping of the earth is and how it does lend itself to good air drainage. And so this does make a good point that backyard sites can be challenging and growing tree fruit can be challenging. You see a butterfly here on this limb, but that's just one of the many insects that can be attracted to a fruit tree. But most of our insects that are attracted can be detrimental to the whatever fruit tree and cause problems, whether it's feeding on the leaves or feeding on the fruit. Nobody really likes to find those worms in their fruit. So here we'll talk about winter hardiness. Our state is especially a long state where we have different winter hardiness zones. And so in the north, we're going to have that colder weather, and in the south, we'll have a little bit warmer temperatures. And so even the same particular cultivar of a tree may have a different type of growing pattern depending on where it's located in the state. So we see that there's cold injury susceptibility on this chart for the fruit crops. So your most susceptible fruit crops are going to be your apricot. And so usually the spring will come and you'll have blooms, but those winter temperatures tend to kill back the apricot blossoms, and so you don't get a crop every year. Sweet cherry is another one that's sensitive. Your peaches and nectarines, but the least sensitive is probably your apple tree, and so that's why we see it broadly across the whole state of Illinois. Here I'll talk about accumulated chilling hours. So in order for these trees to go through their dormant period, they need to accumulate chilling hours so that they can do their physiological processes. And so we see there's an accumulation, there's very low cold accumulation in the lower part of Texas and Florida. And so we don't typically see the same kind of fruits grown down in the south as we do here in the northern part of the United States. And here in the Midwest, we have adequate chilling temperatures. Here we see 500 to 1,000 for apple, but there's also some low chill cultivars that don't take as much chilling. And the pear and the plum has 250 to 700. So there's varying degrees of these chilling hours, and they can vary with the cultivar selection. And in your cultivar selection, you'll especially want to pay attention to disease resistant. That may be something to think about, because the more disease resistance you have, the less you have to worry about those diseases. But not all varieties have the same level of resistance, and we'll cover that here in the future slides. You need to think about the texture of the fruit and your flavor preference. I know my wife and we don't like the particular same apples or some other fruits. She particularly likes the tart, and I like the sweet. Rootstock compatibility. There are some differences in rootstocks, and so we'll be looking at that a little bit further. The size, the yield, vigor, and biennial bearing is important. Apple trees tend to, if you have a large crop, some of these apple cultivars will only tend to bear every other year. So practices of thinning can help to reduce that. The harvest date of when these apples are going to be harvested, we'll cover that. And it's important to be aware of when that's going to happen and what kind of apple you'll be choosing. The kind of uses. Are you going to be making apple pie? Are you going to be making applesauce? There's all kinds of uses for apples or pears or peaches, and the maturity of the fruit and how long they're going to store can all be considerations. I have a question, is there audio? And the audio is hopefully going on. So with Cultivar Selection, we also have our rootstock. And so when we refer to rootstock, we're talking about the lower portion of the tree, below the graft union. The top portion of the tree is called the scion, and it's your selected cultivar that you're desiring to have the fruit from. We have hardiness, can play a factor in this. Soil type adaptability. Some rootstocks are more successful in different types of soils. They do offer some pest resistance and disease resistance for some of these kinds of rootstocks, but the overall tree size is what's dependent upon the rootstock. So a standard tree would be on a seedling rootstock, and it doesn't have very much control over the size. Then you have semi-dwarf and also dwarf. These dwarfing rootstocks produce sooner. They're more effective to manage. You can have more trees per acre, and there's a consideration that you are going to need some kind of support or staking whenever it comes to these dwarfing rootstocks. But unfortunately, the nurseries aren't very forthcoming with what kinds of rootstocks they've used, and so typically they'll only have a small description. But here we see with the stability of trees, these dwarf trees do need to be staked. And so that helps to protect them and their graft union. And you can see the detriments of not being properly staked here on the photo to the right. There is a pollination requirement for our fruit trees. Cross-pollination is a very important part. We have to choose cultivars that have overlapping bloom dates, so the time that they are in bloom is going to be important. For apples, you need at least 2 cultivars, but 3 is better. And Golden Delicious is a great choice. It's one that has been widely used as a great pollinator. Here we have an example of apples. We see the different bloom periods, early, mid, and late. And so you can look and see what particular bloom period is in green for the particular cultivar and be able to select similar cultivars that would be in the same pollinating time frame. Most fruit trees are not going to set fruit if they're grown in isolation, so they're going to need to be within 50 to 100 feet to make sure they have adequate pollination. And they're going to need another variety for pollination, and they'll be able to produce better whenever they're pollinated by another variety. Then we have the differences in self-unfruitful or self-fruitful. So the apples, pears, and plums are going to need to be pollinated by another pollinizing tree, but the nectarines, peaches, and cherries are self-fruitful, so you don't need to have another kind of cultivar for those. There are some that are partially to fully self-fruitful apples, and these are the Brayburn, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, and Red Rome. But we also have pollen sterile apples. So the pollen sterile apples, they typically have the requirement of 2 other cultivars, because you'll need another cultivar to pollinate the apple that is sterile, and since it is sterile, it cannot pollinate the tree that is pollinating that sterile apple. And so because of that, you need the additional fruit tree to pollinate your pollinating tree or your pollinizer. So 3 trees typically for these pollen sterile apples. You may ask, why are they pollen sterile? Well, typically these are called triploid kind of trees because of the amount of chromosomes that they have, and that affects their ability to receive the pollen into the ovary to create the fruit. So here we see the pollination requirements for apple and cherry, and you can see that with the diagonal line across these charts, you can see that most of these, or all of these, are particular in that they cannot be pollinated by themselves. Most of your European plums require cross-pollination. The European prune are self-fruitful, and the Japanese plums require cross-pollination. It's important to pick out a good tree out of your nursery, so choosing a reputable nursery that has a high quality is important. You want to choose trees that are 4 feet tall, 1/2 to 3/4 inch in diameter. Be sure that the trees are of a sound structure, and be sure to check that graft union whenever you're investigating the tree. The biggest tree doesn't always mean the best. When it comes to planting, you want to dig 1.5 times the size of the root ball for a balled and burlap tree, and no more shallow, because you don't want the tree to be too deep. Again, we can have that wet feet scenario. But there are other ways of getting a fruit tree. Sometimes they are grown in a container, and otherwise they can be ordered bare root. And if you receive your trees bare roots, you'll need to have adequate moisture and keep them in a cool location until they can be planted. You want to plant in the early spring, sometimes in the fall of the year, but mostly in the early spring as soon as the ground can be worked up. And if you do choose to mulch as soon as possible after planting, but you need to be wary that some rodents like voles can also make a nice habitat with that mulch. Use caution when planting near walls. Avoid planting on the north side of buildings because of the shade factor, and the west side of buildings you can have poor fruit drying. You need to avoid planting in a soil refill situation. A lot of times some homeowners have soil brought into their landscape, but also avoid a hard pan. The hard pan, the tree roots are not going to be able to penetrate that hard pan and cause problems in the future. Avoid planting next to black walnut, pine, or other allelopathic trees, and do not plant under shade trees because you won't have adequate sunlight. You need full sun of that, typically 8 to 10 hours. Your fertilization, you want to fertilize 3 times right after planting, at 2 weeks, 6 weeks, and 10 weeks after planting, with approximately a third pound of 10-10-10 each time. After this, we can fertilize once per year with a nitrogen fertilizer at approximately a quarter per year. Fertilize in the fall after leaf drop or in the early spring. Sometimes if you had a problem with apple scab, you can add urea to the leaves and help decompose them. Too much fertilizer is just as bad as too little. So think of that whenever there's diseases out there, that whenever you have new lush growth, they can be more susceptible. Another good way of checking your fertilization is with the annual growth rate. So how much growth has the tree put on in a year? So for apple, 12 to 36 inches. And your bearing trees, here we have recommendations for that. If it's not growing very much, it may need additional fertilization. Thinning the fruit is going to be a practice that you'll need to adhere to so you can have good fruit size for apple, pears, peaches, and plums. And again, with that biennial bearing, you want to have return bloom, and so the thinning will help that. Prevent limb breakage. As an extension educator, I get a lot of calls or questions about limbs breaking and what to do, but the best thing to do is to make sure that your fruit has been adequately thinned, so you have using the proper distance between the fruit, usually 6 inches, your fist with your thumb extended, and so you're going to be reducing about 25% of the crop in apple and peach. Pruning's done in the late winter while the tree is still dormant, but just before the growing begins. So for the snowbirds out there, it makes it a difficult time, because traveling away whenever your trees are needing to be pruned is a difficulty. Help recognize where the flower buds are located. So with the reduction of the leaves that you had throughout the growing season, this is an ideal time to locate where those buds are and how to direct them into the proper growth. Your wounds are going to be able to heal faster during this time of year, produce that callus that's going to close off the wounds. And pruning these in a system that's capable of holding the fruit is what you're looking for. You want to increase the structure of the tree and make sure that it's adequate for the crop that you're raising. Good pruning in the first 3 to 5 years can train the growth according to the system used. We'll be covering some systems here in the next few slides. If the limbs are too vertical, the shoots are more likely to be vegetative or not very productive. They won't produce the flowers and thus the fruit. If you get the growth too horizontal, you'll get water sprouts in place of the potential fruit sets. So it's a balance of looking at the way that the tree is structured and trying to accommodate. Some of the same kind of methods that you use for your landscape trees are used for fruit trees for your larger limbs. The 3-step method here I am demonstrating, where you make your first cut, number 1, under the branch. Then you go a little bit further out and make your second cut, and then that reduces the weight of the limb and the chances of peeling the bark, and then you come and make your final cut, cut number 3, from A to B. And here you're maintaining the branch collar, and so that maintains the capacity for the tree to heal itself over. You won't need to have any particular sealants or any of chemicals. It should heal over naturally. Here's an illustration of correct versus incorrect pruning. So you have a nursery grown tree. If it's not pruned properly and adequately, you can have a lot of growth that's not necessary. And so you see in the 6 to 8 years later category on the right, how well structured the tree is on the top, but how a poor structure has occurred in the bottom. Now I'll be detailing more on apple. So for apple rootstocks, there's a variety of them. We have dwarf, semi-dwarf, and semi-standard. But here we have an example of a nursery tag that has one of these labels that's the M27. And in M27 is a very dwarfing rootstock. And so looking at these labels, they may not be very prevalent on how much information they give you, but for this particular one, they gave you a little bit more than most probably. But this gives a little bit of an illustration of where these particular cultivars of rootstocks, where the rootstocks were developed, and how they're abbreviated. And with these rootstocks, we have a diagram here with the size of the tree. So going up to 100% for a standard tree, you can see that the semi-standard and the semi-dwarf, the dwarf, and then the ultra-dwarf, or that M27 that we saw in the last slide. So it does show that there's quite a wide variety of size for these trees, and the larger the tree is, the more you're going to have to manage. So for a typical homeowner, the dwarf, semi-dwarf size may be a good option for you. Now, with apple trees and palm fruit in general, they have a strong apical dominance, and so to reduce that, you can use weights and limb spreaders. And so the spreading of these limbs helps to make them a more horizontal and makes them to hopefully bear more fruit in the future. Here we can see some of these spreader devices. Sometimes we can also use weights. These weights can be made out of a small clothespin to get started. And here we also see toothpicks. Even whenever these limbs are very, very small, using a toothpick in between them to spread out the limb can be a benefit. So starting when the tree is small is going to be the best bet for you whenever you're training your tree. The different training systems, so we'll look at the natural shape kind of system and the Espalier system. Also the different types, the central leader system, the modified leader system, and the open center system. Here we see the central leader system. So a leader is basically talking about the trunk of the tree. And so the trunk for the central leader is you're going to eliminate all others to where you have just one central leader. Now the modified leader is a tree that's been developed, but at a certain point the top of the central leader is modified in that it's removed. And then an open center is a tree that is more of a vase shaped. So for like your peach trees are typically grown on an open center. So for the central leader, you want one main trunk that's about 5 to 8 feet tall. Your lowest branch 18 to 22 inches from the ground. Your main branches of the tree are called your scaffold branches. And so you want those 4 to 8 inches apart vertically. And in your pruning practices, you want to make sure that things are distributed well in the canopy of your tree, and that you have 40 to 90 degree crotch angles because they're a stronger angle for the branches. In pruning to a central leader, you can top the trees to a height of approximately 30 inches to stimulate the growth of the central leader, wait, and develop a good airflow through the tree so it can help prevent some disease occurrence. But again, we're choosing one dominant leader and prune out all the other limbs that may show some co-dominance. What to look for in a training system: adequate light penetration, the effect on the fruit. Again, you'll want the fruit to color well and to get to a good size. And the establishment cost. Some of the different kinds of systems can have a higher cost. And here we have Espalier. And so this is a very formal kind of growing of a apple tree or a pear tree. And so a lot of pruning and attention goes into, but if you get a tree from a nursery, you can do the type of system here, but it's important to where these branches are started whenever you get the initial tree and working with it to get it into this kind of shape and fashion. Now I'll talk about some of the generalities of apple diseases. We have Fireblight, which is a bacterial disease. It can affect the flowers and leaves and twigs. And it's sometimes confused with a bacterial blight, and we'll cover that here in a short while. Scab is a common occurrence. It's a fungal disease of the leaves and fruit. If you have an apple tree, it wouldn't be surprising to possibly have some scab. And we also have summer diseases, your sooty blotch, fly speck. These in particular, they are more cosmetic. You could still eat the fruit even if they have these. But you want to also look at black rot and white rot. They can occur, and we want to look at curbing that before they begin. So for your apple scab, if you have a crabapple tree, that could be an inoculum for your regular apple tree. So look for resistant cultivars for your apple tree, but also be thinking if you have any crabapple trees that you'll also want a variety that is resistant. A fire blight can occur from over-fertilization or poorly drained sites. And cedar apple rust needs two hosts, an apple and an eastern red cedar. And so here is cedar apple rust, and you'll want to keep your distance. If you have an apple tree, be aware of what kind of evergreen juniper kind of trees or shrubs you may have on the property. So for some disease-resistant apple cultivars, we have different times of the season. So our early season varieties, Red Free, Prima, Johnafree, Surprise, mid-season varieties, late season varieties, a popular one, Gold Rush, and there are some other disease-resistant available, but it's important to note that not all disease resistance is equal. Here we have Fireblight. This is actually a pear sample, and we can see the shepherd's crook happening on the photograph on the left, but there's also a blossom blight or another type of pathogen that can affect and looks somewhat similar. So you may want to send a sample to the U of I plant clinic and make sure that you have Fireblight if you're not seeing the classical symptoms of the shepherd's crook. Management of the fire blight in apples, planting resistant cultivars, but also think about the ones that are more susceptible. And so you probably would want to stay away to some extent for the apples that are highly susceptible as a homeowner. And also think about the wide variety of apples that can be planted. You do have a lot of choices when it comes to what you would like to plant. But here we have scab resistance in apple cultivars. So these particular cultivars are resistant to scab, but they're not necessarily resistant to fire blight. So make that in a choice and a selection can also be important. Talking about Apple insects, we don't have time to really go into great detail, but aphids can occur on apples. They can cause a curling of the leaves, something to be on the lookout for. Apple tree borers, your round-headed borers, excuse me. They cause holes in the bark, and you can often see frass being excreted from that. That's their waste. Stink bugs can cause problems, and the stink bugs, one in particular is a brown marmorated stink bug. Has been a new attraction to our area. The apple maggot typically happens in northern Illinois. Codling moth, plum cucurleo, and San Jose scale are all typical here for our insects. We have a question: can you grow apples successfully without spraying? Well, you could grow apples possibly successfully to an extent. You'll probably have an apple, but it may not be very appetizing with the diseases and the insect damage that would occur. So in order to get it to a more cleaner as far as diseases and insects, there's just it's a very challenging effort. So you probably will need to have some kind of spray that you're going to be applying to these trees, whether it's a dormant oil or insecticides in the future. But with that being said, it doesn't have to be like a calendar regimented kind of spray for every kind of spray. Depending on our weather, you can have years where you may get by without applying but maybe a particular fungicide because there's no leaf wetness. Some of these diseases require a degree of leaf wetness for them to occur. So if you don't have the leaves being wet, you're not going to need to particularly spray. Here we have the normal harvest sequence for apples. So these apples, will start in this, and if it's a particular normal year, it'll have a normal harvest sequence, but strange things can happen, and this may get off a little bit depending on the season, but typically you will find these from left to right in the order that the harvest occurs. Some good apple cultivars for Illinois. A lot of these are known for their disease resistance. Some of these have been developed with a collaboration of other universities with Illinois. And we'll move into the pear. A pear, as I said, typically is one that Fireblight is a main concern. So here I have some resistant cultivars for the pear, and also some of the highly susceptible cultivars, and those kind of in the middle of that for moderate resistance. Pear diseases, since they are in the pome family, they have a lot of similar diseases to apple, and the Fireblight, Scab, rust, anthracnose, and powdery mildew. Pear insects, the codling moth, pear scale, aphids. Pear tree pruning is going to be similar to apples. You want to eliminate the topping of the tree. The pears are typically a very soft and weak-wooded tree, so a lot of times you'll have pear tree damage in a storm. You also want to limit the thinning. You want to limit to thinning out, only thinning out the branches. Some good pear cultivars for Illinois. The importance here is also to note how they are pollinated. So you need to do some research. The Duchess, Stark, Moonglow, Maxine, and Starking Delicious do not pollinate each other. And so if you have these in your setting, they're not going to pollinate one another. and the Seckel and Bartlett will not pollinate each other. So be mindful of that. For peach, we have disease resistance for bacterial spot. Bacterial spot can cause that shot hole kind of appearance in the leaves and cause a blemish on the fruit. So here are some disease-resistant cultivars. Here we have disease resistance bacterial spot, but these are the ones that are more susceptible. So when looking at this, these are going to be the ones that are going to have the bacterial spot, and you can see that in the illustration here in the photograph. Some good peach cultivars for Illinois, Reliance for northern Illinois, and peaches tend to grow generally south of I-70, and some on the western part of the state, Jersey, Calhoun counties. Calhoun County is very well noted for its peaches. But once you get up to, the line above I-70, especially in that hardiness zone, where it differentiates between Springfield area, you're going to lose the amount of ability to grow peaches. Peach tree pruning, they're pruned at an open center. So you're going to top at a height of 30 inches. Form your scaffold branches. Generally, there's 3 to 4 scaffold branches. You'll prune back to the second bud, and the first branch no lower than 18 inches. You want to keep the fruit somewhat off the ground, but you don't want to have the fruit so high in the future, because you will have to pick it. The peach grows on new wood, and so it'll be on the tops of the tree branches. If the tree is branched but the branches are poor, prune back all the branches and let the tree have a growing season to put some branches on, and choose your scaffold branches then prune like you would have in the previous year. So here's an example of some peach pruning. You have before pruning, and you're cutting back, and you're developing these scaffold branches over time, and after you have pruned, you'll have some 3 to 4 main scaffold branches, and you can see that here in the photograph on the right. And so you can also see that most of the growth is not in the center of the tree, and that's open, and most of the growth is directed outward from the tree. You also need to think about rodent control. So your deer, the voles are small creatures. This is a vole guard on the photo on the right. So protecting your tree and knowing what creatures can affect it, and again, providing that protection can make the difference, especially with your young, newly planted tree. Sanitation, prune out and destroy all your dead and diseased shoots and limbs. But in thinking about that, whenever it comes to diseases like Fireblight, it's important to know if it is Fireblight and to have good sanitation practices for your pruning instruments. So you'll want to sanitize those, possibly with a alcohol solution. Bleach solutions usually are corrosive to your pruning tools. Prune the healthy growth to improve air movement. You're going to be improving your light penetration, and that's going to aid in the fruit set and the coloring of the fruit. You want to remove and destroy those fallen leaves that are infected with a disease, like apple scab. Those leaves would need to be destroyed, and remove the particular what are called mummies. So those peaches that have gone bad and they create that mummy or that diseased fruit, you'll want to remove those as well. As far as spraying of the tree fruit, we do have a pest management for the home landscape that has a spray schedule for each of the major fruit trees. And so you can look at that and find what the particular time of the development of the fruit tree is and compare that to what needs to be sprayed, and follow the label instructions, because that is going to tell you what can be sprayed and what cannot be sprayed on what particular crop. Be sure that you're careful about bees and other pollinators. So you don't want to be applying any insecticides during full bloom, and you'll want to keep a steady watch and scouting practices. You can take like a white cooler lid and a stick and beat the branch, a gentle, I guess I'd say, whack, and see if any bugs or insects fall onto that white surface, and then you can look at identifying those and take some precautions there. There's a note in the chat box about the deer stripped off every leaf of my 6-foot apple tree, and I'll say that they do have a good appetite for fruit trees, and so providing protection, maybe a barrier, would be helpful in the future. In harvesting tree fruit, you need to allow it to completely ripen on the tree. There are some exceptions, but in general, you want to allow it to ripen on the tree. Sometimes in the commercial setting, they may pick peaches a little firmer and have them, because they're trying to mitigate the shipping of them. But the benefit of growing these in your own backyard is that you can go out and pick them just at the right time whenever they're ripened. You'll also know if they have been sprayed with any insecticide, because you'll be the one taking care of them. So don't try and store any diseased or damaged fruit, as it can cause the other fruits to perish as well. Some good Japanese plum cultivars for Illinois. Some good European plum cultivars for Illinois. Plant any 2 of these for cross-pollination. Some good sweet cherry cultivars. So we have self-pollinating types and cross-pollinating types. So the self-pollinating type, again, are not going to need another pollinizer, but the cross-pollinating types would. And the good tart cherry cultivars for Illinois, quite a variety. And so investigating these, finding out when their bloom period is and what their good characteristics are, can help in your selection practices. There are some additional resources. There's Managing Pests in the Home Fruit Planting, publication by Purdue. It does have nice illustrations of the development of where the bud stages are and what particular spray schedules could be adhered to. We do have the publication that I mentioned before, Pest Management for the Home Landscape. That usually is typically a publication that's readily available at an extension office. If you want your excuse me, own copy of that, it is available from Pubs Plus. There's also a Midwest Home Fruit Production Guide that has a lot of wealth of information in it, and it's available online. And there's a lot of more references that you can get for apple trees, pear trees, plums, just a wide variety of resources that are available. So check out with your local extension, and they can guide you in the right direction. So now I'll take any questions that anyone might have. You might have questions here of these photographs. So this was a particular year that had unusual weather, and you had both flowering and fruit both in the fall. And then this tree on the right hand side had fallen over and it was still flowering and blooming even though it had been left there for quite some time. Again, I'll take any messages in the chat box. Okay, a message for your new home grower. What would you recommend? Apple, pear, etc. Well, I would think for a new home grower, some of these particular fruit trees are going to be challenging. I would probably investigate, take a look at the spray guides that are available and see what kind of input that's going to have on what the practices will be. It will be a challenge. Probably the most challenging fruit tree would probably be the apple. Is the amount of diseases and insects that occur with it. I do have my contact information here. If you have any other questions, if you want to still put them into the chat box, you're welcome to. If you want to jot down my email address or give me a call later, that would be fine as well. Question, how far do the plum trees need to be from pine? It is a good question. I'd have to do a little bit of research on that. I know like with black walnut, it's usually probably 50 to 75 feet away from the tree to avoid those allelopathic effects. But you also have to consider the distance for pollination of these trees. So depending on the kind of plum, it's still going to need to be pollinated. So probably within that 100 feet, probably be a good recommendation. There's a chance that it would be okay. I would probably, if it's been established for a while, I would probably not relocate it. No, it should be all right then. We do have the past recordings of our Four Seasons Gardening Series available online, go.illinois.edu Four Seasons recordings. So if you're interested in watching this presentation or any of our others, you can go there to take part in that. You're very welcome. Thank you for attending the program. It has been a pleasure of mine, and hope you have a nice evening.